Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, serial entrepreneurs, and experienced investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup, from pre-seed to IPO, with your host, Jon Chee. In our last episode, Amy shared stories from her childhood in Dallas, the influence for her parents and grandparents, and how her first day at MD Anderson as a receptionist coincided with the arrival of President John Mendelsohn. If you missed it, check out part 1. In part 2, Amy talks about her transition from patient advocate to administrative fellow, a coveted role MD Anderson had never awarded to an internal candidate before, and how she leveraged her ground-level understanding of patient experience and clinical operations to differentiate herself. She shares how this fellowship opened doors to operating rooms, clean rooms, and C-suite strategy, ultimately leading her to radiation oncology and Dr. James Cox's vision to build MD Anderson's first Proton Therapy Center. She also recounts the story of MD Anderson's first satellite clinic in Bellaire, Texas, a flea-bitten facility she and her team transformed into a roaring success by meeting patients where they were, proving that convenience and compassion could coexist with world-class care.
And again, kind of continue with the Anderson theme, MD Anderson still has, and at that time had, what they called administrative fellows. And these were kind of prized positions, usually 2 to 4 a year, that you could apply for out of after you finished your master's, and you got to spend a year working with the COO, the CFO, the really C-suite to learn the organization from that perspective. MD Anderson had never hired anyone in that fellowship position internal before. I was even told this is probably not going to happen. We usually go to, the Wash U's, and we go to these premier schools, which I understood. And so as I was going into those interviews, I was trying to come up with how could I differentiate myself? And I think the way that I was able to do that, thankfully, was by showing that I could take all of those experiences and apply them at a C-suite level for even greater impact. I understood what it was like to check in the basement in radiation oncology and why they didn't like being in the basement. I understood, why having to wait for 3 hours to get your blood drawn when you have been MPO for a scan is torturous. Because not only had I run those clinics, but I also been a patient advocate and tried to help those people get through those hard times. So I was very lucky that I was able to get one of those spots, and then spent that next year working with the senior leadership of MD Anderson.
Cool.
Not only understanding how the whole complex worked, but, really participating in it, not being a bystander, but, rolling up my sleeves and getting my hands dirty.
And also it's just like, I can't talk about just like the opportunity to be a knowledge sponge. It's like truly drinking out of the fire hose, like just amount of like you can be learning on the fly. And I think something that stood out to me that you brought up is, with all, like, I've always, like, there's another company, I can't really remember who it was. It might have been Amazon, I think. But Bezos would still take, like, customer support calls and tickets. It's kind of that type of magic where it's like it is so valuable to just, like, to kind of, like, put yourself in the shoes of other people in your organization. It's kind of almost like shadowing, or just like putting yourself there, because I think when you have more empathy and understanding for that role, it just like, it makes the team work better together. And it's hard. And especially as you kind of like rise in, your ranks and you're starting to manage more cross-disciplinary teams, it's probably hard to manage something that you only know in the abstract versus like, oh, like I've I've actually been there. Like I was there kind of like, I know kind of what goes into it and just makes you a more effective leader to be able to be like, just like Bezos is like, oh, no, no, no. I've taken a support call or like I've been in the kind of the support chat before and it really just continues to like round out one's experience. So it's really cool that, you know, you had that and also, landed the fellowship. And it sounds like that fellowship experience, like, can you just talk about some of like the cool stuff that, as a fellow that you were able to get involved with?
It was quite remarkable. And, I had the opportunity to go spend time in the ORs and to go into, labs and clean rooms where, you'd never really get that opportunity to see those places. And that just, I ended up becoming very comfortable in them, which in hindsight, I find interesting because, much like you early on, before I went to college, I was sure I was going to be a doctor until I hit organic chemistry, and, and I clearly was not going to be a doctor. But then I still got to experience it. I still like going into ORs and watching, and I still like going into the labs and watching researchers and that sort of thing. So it really kind of opened up, that kind of Pandora's box of possibilities. And I say Pandora's box because sometimes it's the good and the bad, right? You have to start making more choices. So I think, as you're going down your path, the older you get, the more that you make definitive choices that lead you in a certain direction. And it's not always easy to turn back around, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, through that, I really was able to start to focus myself on, okay, what's the next job? What makes me passionate? And that led me actually to the modality of radiation oncology in cancer care. MD Anderson had a chair who's now passed, Dr. James Cox, who became very quickly a mentor, a friend, a father figure in many ways. And he had, this desire to build a proton therapy center, which, proton therapy, there's, multiple around the globe today. At the time, the only really operating facility was in Loma Linda, California, and at Massachusetts General. And we at MD Anderson, under Dr. Cox and his wife, Dr. Komaki's vision, wanted to build one for our patients in Houston. And here comes Dr. Mendelsohn again, the president, and he says to us, that's fantastic. Hire, Dr. Cox, hire Amy, bring her on, have her focus on that, and completely support you. But by the way, I can't give you any money. And I remember us sitting there and thinking, okay, we can do this. And I remember starting to do diligence and been like, Dr. Cox, do you know that's like $120 to $150 million? And that was back in, pre-2000, So that led me down, I think, the choose your own adventure door of, I want to do something hard. And I know it's going to be hard, but it's going to be really good if we can pull it off. Right. And there was 2 inflection points in that first job out of fellowship. One was protons. And the second was trying to see if we could deliver the excellence of MD Anderson outside of the Texas Medical Center. And this is actually where I really met, and to this day, one of my closest friends and mentors, Dan Fontaine. He was at the time, the chief legal officer of MD Anderson. He progressed to really be one of the senior leaders at Anderson running the organization. But at the time, I had this wild idea with the Division of Radiation Oncology that we could open up a satellite for patients in Houston that was 10 minutes away. It was in a place called Bellaire, Texas. Literally, you drive down Holcomb and you run into it. So right down from the hospital. But it was not the Texas Medical Center. It was down the way. And we thought that this would be extremely valuable to patients because they could drive their cars up to the door. They could park for the course of their radiation, anywhere from, 4 to 8 weeks, 6 weeks. They would go in, they would see the same people every single day. They'd probably see their doctors most days, not just one day a week on weekly treats. And they would like that. They wouldn't have to pay for parking. They wouldn't have to park and walk and navigate the medical center. They would be able to take this piece of their day that they are obligated to do for the next 6 weeks and simplify it. And we took this to, at the time, the MD Anderson Physician Network Board, not once, not twice, but 3 times in order to get it approved. And my mentor slash, friend at the time, Dan, said, Amy, you realize this is a flea-bitten dog. This is it's not a great facility. It's outside the medical center. But finally, on that 3rd round of approvals, he said, but you wore us down. We're going to let you do this little experiment. Come back to us when it doesn't work. And I will tell you that we, as a team, brought up this dingy center. We selected the right doctor and the right staff, and immediately it was a roaring success because patients loved it. They loved it. They felt like this was their little family for 6 to 8 weeks. They didn't want to go to the med center. And over time, that really has instilled the infrastructure today. So 20 plus years later of MD Anderson having large satellite facilities all around the Houston Metroplex that just make it a little bit easier for patients who are having to do that every day. So kind of pulling those 2 examples together, I think that it was the inspiration and the excitement around a challenge. So bringing, there's a huge challenge that if I think it's going to be meaningful, I'm willing to do whatever it takes. If that means personally calling every patient who's scheduled for a new patient appointment in the med center and radiation and asking them nicely if they would like to be seen in Bellaire, I did it. I literally made cold calls because I was so committed to providing this to people that, that passion allowed us to not only show it as an example, but then to extrapolate it out for more and more people over time, far past me even being at the organization.
That's super rad. And I love how, with kind of like ambitious, kind of out of the box initiatives, it like extra persistence and like wearing people down is a viable strategy. Like it's like if you're persistent, you can get there. And I think I got a question for you is like, you started off with like no budget, like figure it out. How did you start to get like, I'm going to imagine there was like some, like once you got approval, there's like to get this thing stood up, you had to get like the purse strings had to open in some way. Or maybe not. I'd love to learn, like, how did you stand this thing up from starting from zero, in a large organization?
I must say first, it was absolutely like a team effort. There was, we had kind of like a little Proton family, Dr. Cox, Dr. Kamaki, my boss at the time, Mitch Latinkich, she was an incredible mentor for me. And we literally functioned as a small little family unit, and we came up with a plan and started talking to people about the benefit of protons. We weren't talking about the dollars. We weren't talking about the cents. We were talking about like just how this could really make a difference to patients that don't have any other options. Pediatric patients who, are going to survive and grow. So the harmful effects of radiation, you want to minimize as much as possible. You want to spare that healthy tissue. Patients with, brain cancers and chondrosarcomas, where the tumor or the target is so close to critical structures that you can't afford to harm them because that quality of life matters. And as we started doing that, I think one of the keys to our success was, in fact, Dr. Ritsuko Kamaki, which kind of brings me to another kind of point in the story that made a huge impact on me. Dr. Kamaki grew up in Hiroshima, Japan, She was there with her family when the bomb went off. She spent her entire life devoted to trying to not make radiation a negative, but making it a positive. And she was so committed with Dr. Cox to making sure we got protons at MD Anderson for our patients. It didn't matter how, it didn't matter how long it took, we were going to do it, and with that kind of personal passion and that message, we were able to thankfully make the right connections and start raising the right kind of money. And I say that very purposefully. We ended up developing a triple LC in which we had a investment banking partner, Sanders Morris Harris, at the time, and we had a general partner who was in charge of building and operating the Stiles company, John Stiles and his father, John Stiles Sr., that we brought into our family, and our family became bigger. And all of a sudden, it wasn't just business and science. It was investment banking, and it was construction, and it was management. And so as we started building this kind of consortium of believers who were just passionate about making this happen, we were able to come up with a process to go to market and raise the funds. But then this little weird thing happened called September 11th. And we had just gotten our private placement memorandum done, which is this huge, thick thing. And it talks all about the investments and the science. And it's, it took months and months and months, not to mention all of the legal documents. I think we had 12 that tied all these parties together. And we were about to ready to go to market. We'd already primed the, New York. We had meetings set up, and 9/11 happened. And I remember being at MD Anderson. I was with Mitch Latinkage. We had walked to the park to get Starbucks. We were very excited. We finally got a Starbucks, which now sounds silly. They're on every corner, but we were very excited. And we were walking back with our Starbucks, and we looked up at the TV, and it was in the GU clinic. And we were watching the plane go into the first tower. And we didn't say a word to each other. We just kind of walked back to our office and not really understanding fully the trickle down impact of that moment, right? And we all have our 9/11 stories, and they're all impactful and sometimes painful. But that was a moment that we didn't really understand what that was going to mean for what we did next, right? Because overnight, the markets evaporated. Capital was nowhere to be found. We were stopped in our tracks. And it was a moment where there was a few of us that, were like, okay, maybe we were wrong. Maybe this is the wrong path. Maybe, maybe we need to switch gears. And we didn't. Again, we persisted. We're like, nope, this is important. This is just a moment in time. We're going to rally, just like we rallied as a country. We're going to rally. But we've got to change our approach, because it's not good enough for it to be a financial investment anymore. It's got to be bigger than that. So we need to change who we're getting money from. So instead of looking at the big banks on Wall Street and investment PE firms, we completely shifted gears and said, let's look at local people who this might actually impact, who cancer impacts. And the first group that we went to was the firefighters pension fund and the police officers pension fund. Because for firefighters, lung cancer is prevalent in this population because of what they do. They inherently breathe in smoke. It's a carcinogenic. It could lead to cancer. And we went to them and we explained why we were so passionate about this therapy. And we heard so many of them talk about family members, their dad who was a firefighter, their son who had, even if it wasn't cancer, chronic conditions due to that. I mean, a noble service that we have to have in our world. And they liked it. They were willing, and they were able to invest in a way which they could be proud of. They were proud to tell their people that they were investing in protons, and that center might be able to treat somebody in the future with lung cancer. That center will make a difference to the people that we are supporting. And so it was a really interesting time in which, at all times, we all have these. You have to kind of step back a second, recalibrate, catch your breath, lick your wounds, and then figure out how to pivot. And in this way, I think that we pivoted toward the people, toward the passion. Tried to, money is important. They have to support their pension funds. Absolutely. But on the other hand, that wasn't what we were selling. We were selling the promise of making a difference. And it caught on. And we were able to raise $125 million and launch the project. So it was a incredible experience. I mean, an incredible group of people. I was just one piece in the big wheel. But I think it really did impact how I started growing from there.
That's incredible. And we'll talk about a successful pivot. Sometimes, it's just like, again, it's kind of, I don't know if it's like cliche, but just like kind of like getting knocked off the horse, getting back up again. Cause like,
Yes.
that must have been a massive gut punch. Just like, oh my God. Like, this could just completely just eliminate, it could be gone. Like, and you're like, okay, let's go back to like first principles here and figure out, I love just like, who is like directly impacted by this, like, and going to the source. And I love that. And I think it creates an alignment, just like a great alignment. It's like finding that alignment that it seems you have found. And so you're off to the races. Like your resource to get this thing going. Talk about just like getting this thing up and running. And now, was it just smooth sailing from there, or was it like?
I mean, that would be way too easy. Yeah, the story can't stop there. So we were able to raise the money. We started the construction. It was a point two where I actually technically left Anderson and took over the role as the chief operating officer at the Proton Therapy Center for a few years, just to really, kind of live and breathe it. I had my hard hat and my safety goggles, and, we chose Hitachi as our technology partner. So it was definitely a journey. I mean, it took 3 years to get it up and operational. So much sweat and hard work from everybody involved. And, as we continued down, there was always some hiccup, whether it was, loss of indications that were reimbursed for proton therapy, or working with the government on, how does proton become a standard of care in certain diseases. I mean, it's a journey. It's in a lot of ways very similar to researchers. There's always something. And so you have to have that almost moxie to just continue, and to find the positive and to create relationships, and I do think those were years where I really saw the value of not just aligning with people, but also finding people that are not like you to align with, to surround yourself with all of your gaps, right? I'm not a physicist. We needed a head of physics who was brilliant. And trying to really put together the right team of people that made everything better as one, and probably worse alone. And I think that's part of that alignment component, which is very much kind of a fundamental of how I negotiate deals today. It's an alignment, a purpose, and then an alignment of incentives. And if you can accomplish those two things, my experience has been that you've got a contract that you can put in the drawer and never look at again, because everybody is doing the right thing for the right reasons and going to benefit from it.
I love that. And like just hearing this is, it's almost like it's like you had a entrepreneurial journey within a larger organization. I guess the term is like intrapreneur, like that sounded like a startup, kind of what you just described, right? It's like, all right, you have you and your co-founder. Here's $0.
Go.
And there's go, and there's go do your thing. Like here's a massive undertaking, but you have no resources. Go figure it out. And then you even had a pivot, like a massive pivot that and it's a lesson in also too, like there's only so much you can control. It's just like there are these external factors that are like, again, you're just going to get punched in the mouth like on this journey. It's not even like everyone's journey. You're going to get punched in the mouth at some point in time. It's really a matter of how do you handle it? Like, how are you going to deal with that? Are you going to let it just like be a permanent setback, or are you going to try again? And from there, I mean, it's something too is just like exactly what you described is when you can find that perfect alignment of interests, purpose, and also just get back to like the your early kind of like the profit kind of like, if you can add in the kind of like economic incentive too, that's when that flywheel really starts to move really, really quickly, and you start to scale impact in a lot of ways, which is awesome to see. And there's probably a whole another podcast, but it's like learning. Was this your first kind of time working with regulatory bodies? Like,
yes, that was a whole new era, right? I mean, it was when we first started embarking on protons. In fact, there was no code. There was no code. There was no reimbursement, and that was a whole journey. I mean, and that was completely new territory for me, right?
Yeah.
Thankfully, we were able to develop a consortium of people that had protons and people that wanted protons.
Yeah.
And so it was also, too, a great example of, while you might think you're competitors, you're really not.
Yeah.
There's enough, out there for everybody. And the value of coming together as a consortium far outweighs any risk. But yes, exactly. The regulatory side of it is not inconsequential, and it can only is it costly, but it really is more about the time. It's the cost of time and how that impacts you accomplishing your goal, and we see that in biotech, right? I mean, so it's not just one industry. I think it's kind of across the spectrum.
You can spend your whole life just like working on regulatory, and just like making sure that it works effectively. So again, just like the amount of like learning, it's like I'm jealous. Like you kind of just like had this opportunity to kind of like just get that exposure across tons and tons of domains. And as the Proton Center was starting to really hit its stride, like I can imagine there was it's like I can keep doing this in forever. But like as you continue in your career, I know you started to transition to different roles. So like when did you know it was like time to move on from the Proton Center?
This is where I would also say, if I could tell my 20-year-old self to be a little patient, that would be an invaluable piece of information. So, after we got protons up and running, it was probably about 6 months or so. And I found myself getting bored. And it's interesting because this has actually been a personal problem for me. My entire career, once I accomplished something and we achieved that goal, one would think that you would be really excited and happy. And I actually find that the most depressing day, because the question is, what's next? What are you going to do next? And I kind of went through a little bit of this kind of almost a little bit of a depression. Like, the center's up and running now. We've got reimbursement. People are referring. We're helping patients. We're doing good work. But I was getting bored. So one of the things that Proton did allow me was an exposure to a much broader global health scene. And as I started to get exposed to that, I started to realize, you know what? My perspective is very US centric, and it's very academic US centric. And by the way, really only about 20% of cancer patients have the opportunity to go to an academic US, center, your top 11, if you will. 80% of cancer gets taken care of in the community. So am I really making the biggest impact I can make if I'm sitting at, one of the most astounding and incredible centers, but I'm only making an impact on the people that can actually come here, right? And your average person in the community can't always access that. Not to even mention your average person in Uganda or in Japan or in, wherever it is, Dubai, pick your favorite nation. I really got passionate about the whole concept of how do we provide access, irrespective of where you live. And during that time was another big pivot point that to this day is still, I think, absolutely a cornerstone of what I do every day when I wake up, which is I got introduced to Albert Einstein in Sao Paulo. So Hospital Albert Einstein in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And I started working with them on their cancer program. They were interested in protons, but they were also just at the fledgling as a very, very large acute care hospital that had oncology, but it wasn't oncology only, it was everything. And so I very slowly started just experiencing cancer care delivery and healthcare delivery from a different perspective outside of the US. And what I realized was that there are incredible people everywhere. And the human part of them is always trying to do good, right? And so it's not about what your lab coat says if you're at the number one cancer center or at the, one that's not even on the list. It's about how you treat that patient and do the very best you can for them. As I got more and more involved with Albert Einstein in Brazil, I also at the time got very involved with American Hospital in Istanbul, in the Koch Family Foundation and their medical school, as well as other locations around the globe. But it provided exposure that I hadn't had before. And that then brought me back into the MD Anderson proper fold. I had started to do a lot of consulting around the world. And in my role as CEO of the Proton Center, and Anderson looked over and said, hey, why don't you come back in and help us develop the MD Anderson Cancer Network, which eventually was not only in the United States, but also really a global program of creating relationships and collaborations in many different forms, research, clinical delivery, but relationships in which Anderson could share its knowledge and allow, that knowledge sharing to create better clinical delivery, better outcomes for patients, regardless of who they were. And that's how I got back into more of the overarching cancer care and healthcare delivery system internationally.
That's all for this episode of the Biotech Startups podcast featuring Amy Hay. Join us next time for part 3, where Amy recounts the audacious plan to raise $125 million for MD Anderson's Proton Therapy Center, how 9/11 forced a complete pivot in fundraising strategy, and why selling to firefighters and police officers' pension funds became the key to success. She'll also unpack what happened when she got bored after the center launched, her transition to global oncology work with the Einstein Center in Brazil, and the hard-earned lesson that what works in Houston doesn't always work in Sao Paulo or anywhere else. If you enjoyed the show, subscribe, leave a review, or share it with a friend. Thanks for listening, and see you next time. The Biotech Startups podcast is produced by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Search for the Biotech Startups podcast wherever you get your podcasts and click subscribe. Exceeder provides research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support paths to exceptional outcomes. To learn more, visit our website www.exceedr.com. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening. The Biotech Startups podcast provides general insights into the life science sector through the experiences of its guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from the podcast is at the user's own risk. The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not the views of Exceeder or sponsors. No reference to any product, service, or company in the podcast is an endorsement by Exceeder or its guests.